A good mechanic is a bit like a good IT support team. In the ideal environment, you don't think about it, but when it's bad, you get victorious through frontlines. Now, a distinction I think is important to make right away is that difficulty does not inherently make a mechanic good or bad. Yes, in the ideal environment, we want to have mechanics that are easy to learn and hard to master, but being difficult does not inherently mean bad, a concept I'll be exploring later. The discussion around difficulty itself is best left to another video, to be honest. The plan for today is to clarify what I mean by game mechanic, go through some examples of good ones, decent ones, and bad ones, and then we can all have hopefully a nice fun chat about it in the comment section. With that said, before we get started on the video proper, I have to ask for the usual things. A like on the video would be appreciated, and a subscription would be amazing. We've been smashing it recently, and with the 18k mark demolished, well, let's keep aiming high. Let's get to 19k. I know we're going for insane 1k jumps now, but you guys keep impressing me, so I can only hope. Anyway, enough self-shitting. What is a game mechanic? Well, I'm going to be going for a very broad definition here. In essence, it's a game feature or even property that impacts how you experience the game. To give an absurd example, let's leave the realm of video games and consider a Rubik's Cube. A Rubik's Cube can be rotated. That means they have a rotation mechanic, where you can, well, rotate their edges to realign their colors. This naturally applies to intended behavior, for example, rotating a Rubik's Cube, but we can also apply it to what is best described as an emergent property. So for example, let's consider EU4 now, and let's consider the ability to convert a culture using diplomatic points. This is a mechanic or feature. But another feature that is added is that you can cancel the conversion and get a refund of your dip points spent, which means that the ability to culture convert has added two features into the game. One, where you can change the culture of a province using diplomatic points, and another one where you can in practice bank your diplomatic power for the future. The reason I mention this is because I think it's important to say that just because you don't intend for a mechanic to be used in a specific way, does not mean it doesn't exist, and hence it would be unwise to ignore it. In the case of the example just given, if you want to address the dip banking aspect of culture conversions, you can do so by decreasing the percentage of monarch points refunded, for example, and you can tweak that percentage until you're happy with the results. But ignoring the fact that you've just added a form of dip banking to the game, unfortunately does not make the ability to bank dip points go away. Right, I hope we agree at least conceptually on my definition of game mechanics. Let's jump into an example of a bad one. Now I have a very special thing in mind here, and that is going to be something from a rather old game, a game from 23 years ago now, Civilization 3. Now I'm assuming here that if you are a Paradox enjoyer, you'll probably have at least seen Civ at some point, and hence are familiar with its baseline mechanics of citizens, cities, tiles, and tile yields. If you're not, first of all, I'm very impressed. Do tell me in the comments down below, how did you get into Paradox without playing Civ first? But secondly, let's just give a very quick short TLDR of how Civ games work, just so we're all on the same page here. In Civ games, as a general rule, you have these guys called pops. They tend to live in cities, and you send them out into the world into specific tiles. Either these tiles are selected automatically by the game, or you can manually choose which tiles you want to work. These tiles then give you things based on what the tile is. So for example, a grass tile will give you 2 food from foraging in that tile, and a plains tile will give you 1 food and 1 production, for example. Different tiles have different yields, and tiles can be improved. So building a farm, or in the older games irrigating, the tile can increase the food, and building a mine increases the production, for example. There is a lot more going on, but that's all you need to know to understand this example. Now the mechanic in question from Civ 3 that I'm going to mention here is the Despotism Penalty. In Civilization 3 you have a bunch of governments, and those governments have quite a lot of game impact, ranging from how many units you can maintain, think force limit for EU4, to how fast your workers improve tiles, to how corrupt your society is, to how you were affected, if at all, by mechanics such as war wariness, and even some unique mechanics for specific governments, for example communism gaining access to a secret police HQ, which can act as a second palace. These governments are certainly not all made equal, but to prevent you basically switching at a whim to whatever government you want situationally at each point, Civilization 3 had a mechanic called Anarchy, which you would enter every time you switch governments. Anarchy sucks, it is pretty crippling, and is basically something you really want to avoid. Now, here for context, despotism, if you look at its stat line, when comparing itself to other governments, as a default government, it's actually pretty good. It has a good amount of force limit, it doesn't get affected by war wariness, which is a good thing, it had no debuffs to worker speeds, and basically in quite a few cases, looking at stats alone, was actually better than some mid-game governments like feudalism. So if switching governments was painful, you needed to research the government to unlock it, then go into anarchy. What if you just stayed in despotism the whole game? Well, obviously, Civ 3 didn't want you to do that, so it introduced the Despotism Penalty. Now remember, despotism is the default government. If you play this game, you will be spending time in despotism. If you're rushing a new government to leave despotism, you're doing so in despotism. Any campaign of Civ 3 that isn't one where you start with a scenario that involves you having cities and basically taking over a save that's already developed is going to involve you playing in despotism. Even if you give yourself all technologies day one, you still start with despotism and you need to day one anarchy to switch out of despotism. Basically, you're not avoiding despotism, and the despotism penalty, new player or old, if you're playing Civ 3, you're interacting with this mechanic. So what does the despotism penalty do? Well, the despotism penalty reduces all money, production, and food output of each citizen by -1 when they produce more than 2. So, if you were to make 1 food, you still make 1 food. If you make 2 food, you make 2 food. But if you make 3 food, you now only make 2 food because you get the despotism penalty reducing it down to 2. If you were to make 4 food, you would go down to 3, since the despotism penalty only reduces it by 1, and so on and so on. The same applies to money and production. Making 1 or 2 production is fine, but making a 3rd point of production is pointless, as you would make 2 production instead. So getting +1 production meant nothing, unless you already had 3 production, in which case you went from 3 production to 2. First of all, as a penalty, this is quite confusing and hard to explain. You have to basically give an example, and then you are manually explaining the mechanic by going through the numbers. If you are a new player learning the game, this is miserable, because on top of everything else going on, when you're learning Civ, you are subject to trying to understand this. What is also really important to realize is that yes, you start in despotism, but the game just drops you in. It doesn't clarify, oh, by the way, you have the despotism government, which has this debuff. You have to go reach the tech tree or go through menus to find that the governments as a system, as a mechanic exist. And then you need to find the government that you're in, that you start with despotism, and then at the bottom of the description of despotism, you find a little footnote saying, oh, by the way, you have the despotism penalty, after which you have to click on the despotism penalty itself to actually find out what that penalty does. Herein lies the issue, however. The penalty in practice is massive, and its effects are insanely unhelpful for new players. Let us say we're working a 2-food grass tile. We get our first worker out, and we want to build irrigation on this tile, or farm if you're one of the newer Civ players. This farm would give the tile +1 food. So now the grassland makes 3 food. However, we're in despotism, so that 2 food is reduced to 2. And now, congratulations, you wasted worker moves to gain no benefits, and if you're a new player wondering, what does irrigation do? And you do something insanely normal, irrigate a grassland tile, you find out that irrigation does nothing. To say that this is not very intuitive is an understatement, and naturally interacts really weirdly with bonus resources. For example, cattle is a bonus resource you can find on grassland and plain tiles. Cattle give +2 food and +1 production in Civ 3. So, if you have a cattle on a grassland, you have a 4 food 1 production tile, which with despotism becomes 3 food 1 production. If you irrigate it, you get 4 food 1 production. And if you mine it for production, you get 3 food 2 production. No issues there, no weird interactions with despotism. But let's say you have a plains cow, so plains give 1 food and 1 production base, and with a cow they become 3 food 2 production tiles. Or with despotism, you work them for 2 food 2 production. If you were to irrigate a plains cow, you go over to 4 overall food. So you go from 3 food to 2 production with despotism, to getting 4 food down to 3 food with despotism. However, let's say you build a mine on the cow. Well, you go to 3 food 3 production, or 2 food 2 production with despotism, meaning that mining cows makes no sense, which I guess it doesn't, but it also is a counter-argument from earlier. So if you learned that irrigating grassland is pointless, you can then maybe try mining on another tile and find out that mining is also pointless. This also means that once you do learn about the despotism penalty, you just have to remember these things in your head, that, oh, by the way, don't mine plains cows, don't irrigate grassland while in despotism. I can keep going on about how unintuitive this mechanic actually is. Now, of course, again, as you learn the game, you certainly learn to play around it, and more importantly, learn to rush either monarchy or republic to get out of despotism. But it also means that the community has to come up with general rules for new players, like mine green, irrigate brown, referring to grasslands being green and plains being brown. So you can avoid these debuffs in general by making sure to irrigate brown and mine green. Unless, of course, you have plains that have sugar on them, because sugar gives you +1 food, in which case, no, you don't want to provide irrigation to sugar, you want to mine it. Otherwise, the irrigation to sugar does nothing. Paradox. Oh, wait, no, force of habit, sorry. Firaxis. Anyway, the reason I use this example is because it fits so many boxes. It is a counterintuitive mechanic. It encourages gameplay that can at best be described as weird and at worst described as downright counterproductive. The mechanic is mandatory for new players and cannot be avoided. It affects the game in a very stealthy way too, since it's not communicated anywhere clearly that you have this debuff. And even when you do learn the debuff, playing around it optimally involves sacrificing depths of gameplay. For example, if you want to forego production and focus on food early game, and you spawn in grassland, a very common set of things to happen, you can't actually actively do that, because your choice is either getting extra production or getting nothing. All this mechanic does is encourage you to switch out of despotism as soon as possible, and if you want to achieve that, why not just make despotism worse and the other governments better? Basically, the only reason this mechanic exists and brings about all this pain and suffering can be achieved through other better means. And now let's move on to a mechanic best described as fine. It achieves certain goals, but could be better, although it can also be certainly a lot worse. Let's talk about fuel in Hearts of Iron 4. To discuss fuel, we first need to remember what the current Hearts of Iron 4 fuel system replaced: oil as a resource. In Hearts of Iron 4, for those unaware, to build things you need factories, but you also need certain resources, like for example steel to make guns. Not having that resource or having a shortage can significantly decrease the production rate of the equipment you're trying to build, and different resources build different things, like you need rubber for planes and tanks, and you need tungsten for artillery, or chrome for heavy tanks and big ships, for example. Now, before fuel was its own system, oil was just another resource you had to use to build planes and tanks, meaning that when you fueled up a tank or a plane for the first time, it was just good to go and could use that fuel forever. Which of course is naturally quite unintuitive, but at least as a player you would go ahead and build a plane, see, oh, I need oil, and then you'd go ahead and use your planes without having to worry about refueling. Realistic? No, but it doesn't hinder gameplay for new people. Not needing to worry about fuel has the nice side effect of you don't need to worry about fuel. The system that replaced it basically said, wait, you do need to actually refuel your tanks after they roll out of the factory. And what it basically did was turn your oil that you had imported or produced into your country into a fuel income that would then get used by your tanks or planes or whatever else was in use. And you no longer needed oil to actually build your tank. Compared to the previous system, it was more complicated, sure, but it added somewhat historical accuracy to the portrayal of oil being a significantly more important resource, even if that involved more management on the player side. Now, this new fuel system was not without faults. By default, ships, planes, and tanks all use the same oil, which is just not true. Aviation-grade fuel and ship-heavy fuel oil grades exist for a reason. And it also led to classical situations, where a newish player will be playing, for example, Germany. They'd go ahead and build a big navy, but keep it in port, so not using fuel. Then, while they were using their tanks and planes to invade the Soviet Union, they would eventually deploy their new shiny navy out, which would within days suck out all the fuel from all of their planes and tank engines, grounding their air force, stopping their tanks mid-road, and then, as your ships sucked Germany dry of oil in 3 days, they would then themselves run out of oil in the middle of the English Channel. Now, of course, you can assign fuel priorities, and this can be mitigated with a little bit of player skill if you know about those mechanics. But that is not an example of a good feature implementation. Simply put, when a new person is given an order like, let's move the boats out of port, they're not exactly saying, please ground my air force in the process, but that is a consequence of their action nonetheless. Overall, that is a good improvement over the previous system, even if it had weird flaws like the base storage capacity being hilariously low, to the extent that yes, a small German fleet can suck the nation dry in a week. Of course, you can build fuel silos to overcome it, but in practice, if you're running a deficit, that just delays the inevitable. Anyway, overall, I'll give this mechanic a certain pass, and it's a very excellent example of a workhorse mechanic that's not implemented perfectly, but implemented well enough to move on to other bigger issues. However, let's end on a good note, and let's talk about an excellent game mechanic: estates in EU4. So estates in EU4 are good. They provide quite a lot of depth. You can extract a lot of bonuses from them in terms of money, manpower, buffs like development cost and land maintenance costs, or even tolerance of wrong religions. They provide access to unique mechanics through the highly customizable estate privilege interface, and even, for some countries, you have access to a lot of unique flavor by just having access to specific estates. Furthermore, most, if not all, of the estate privileges come with a cost or buff in terms of estate loyalty, estate influence, crown land, or even later, state absolutism. When abused to their full extent, they provide massive bonuses to your country. But high estate influences come with drawbacks like reduced crown land ownership during expansion, and can in some cases lead to massive debuffs for your country as well, ranging from just flat stat debuffs to the threat of coups against your nation. Now, in practice, those coups are very easy to avoid if you know what you're doing, but if you do go into them, they aren't pretty disasters. So the threat is low, but present. They allow for quite a lot of skill expression, providing access to bonuses for those willing to commit to them, and overall add a lot of depth of gameplay. The other thing, however, with estates in EU4 that made me use them as an example is just how good they are for new players. Because if you're learning EU4 or are new to EU4, you have a lot of things you need to keep track of. Armies, revolts, peace deals, diplomacy, ranging from your own diplomacy to enemy diplomacy. You have to figure out how an economy works. You have to look at trade and despair, and all those things are happening at the same time. So that means that most likely, even if you do end up clicking on the estate tab, you can click off it and forget about it without penalty. Estates, if you do nothing with them, have naturally quite low influence and hence provide small buffs in the background, but more importantly, left alone, they're going to be loyal. And they're not going to be disturbing you, not really. Since the average loyalty for the average country for the average estate sits around 50, even the worst events for estate loyalty in the game are going to knock them down to, say, 30%, which is literally within the margin of error of still loyal, as that sits between 30 to 60%, and their low influence will prevent them from gaining any power over the player. Now, of course, as a new person, if you ignore your estates, your country is going to be significantly weaker than if you didn't and abused them. But you don't get actively punished for ignoring estates. It's a mechanic that, when you're ready to discover it and use it, you can use the estates as much as you want, ranging from the full exploitation to them to a couple small privileges here and there. Now, when I was making this section, I was thinking about how seizing land could also be used as a counter to this, since it would cause revolts for a new player. But then I remembered, seizing land is in the estates menu, so if you're ignoring estates, you're also ignoring the seize land mechanic. Hence, you're actually still fine, and even calling estate missions with the diet mechanic exists in that tab, so you're just good. Now, lately, with the newest updates to EU4, there's been a little bit of a weird trend. I believe it kind of started with mods like Ambanar adding missions, like cooperate with a clergy, where you have to complete 3 clergy diet objectives, which for a mod is fine, but they're now starting to add them to the unmodded base game. For example, England has a mission that you need to complete a certain amount of agendas from a certain estate to complete. And that can be confusing for a new player who is actively ignoring estates. But even then, that's a critique of mission design, not a critique of estates themselves. So overall, to conclude, more mechanics like EU4 Estates, and less Despotism Penalty type mechanics, please. With that said, that is all I have time for today. Thank you very much for watching, with a special thank you to Ark and Solar. Goodbye.